All right, let's get right into it. Understanding the history and rights of Indigenous peoples isn't just another chapter in a study guide. Honestly, it's fundamental to understanding the very foundation of Canada itself. So, in this explainer, we're going to build a clear mental map of this essential topic, giving you everything you need for your citizenship test and, really, for being a citizen. We're going to tackle this as a story, a journey. First, we'll meet Canada's First Peoples. Then, we'll explore those early relationships that were built on treaties and alliances. From there, we have to confront the difficult history of assimilation before moving on to a massive turning point, the recognition of rights in the Constitution. And finally, we'll look at the path forward. Trust me, following the story makes all the facts so much easier to remember. So, let's start at the very, very beginning. Long before Canada was even a concept, this land was home to hundreds of distinct nations. They had their own complex societies, their own laws, their own trade networks, and their own territories. They are, without a doubt, the founding peoples of this land. Now, for your citizenship test, this right here is one of the most fundamental facts you absolutely need to know. The Constitution of Canada recognizes three distinct groups of Aboriginal peoples. They are the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis. Burn these three groups into your memory. And to give you a picture of the population today, this chart, which is based on info from Block 154, shows how it breaks down. You can see that about 65% of Indigenous people in Canada are First Nations, about 30% are Métis, and a smaller but incredibly distinct population of 4% are Inuit. What might surprise you here is just how significant both the First Nations and Métis populations really are. Okay, so let's break down the key differences between these groups. This table is your absolute best friend for keeping them straight in your mind. First Nations refers to over 600 unique communities spread all across Canada, south of the Arctic. The Inuit, whose name literally means the people in their own language, Inuktitut, are from the vast Arctic regions. And the Métis are a distinct people with a totally unique culture that grew from the mixing of European, mostly French, and First Nations ancestry, with historic roots in the prairies. Notice their different languages and homelands. Getting this comparison down is crucial for avoiding any confusion on the test. You're going to see two terms used a lot, Aboriginal and Indigenous. It's really important to know the difference. Aboriginal is the specific legal term used in the Canadian Constitution to refer to those three groups we just talked about, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Indigenous is the more modern preferred term that we use today in policy and in global contexts. So for the exam, you need to recognize both, but just remember that Aboriginal has a very precise legal meaning in Canada. Okay, let's move into the period of early contact. You know, it's a really common misconception that Europeans just arrived and took over. But the reality is that the early history of Canada was built on incredibly complex relationships, powerful alliances, and serious negotiations between European crowns and powerful Indigenous nations. And this slide just illustrates that point perfectly. Indigenous leaders were key figures in actually building and defending Canada. You have Joseph Brant, a Mohawk leader, who led thousands of Loyalists into Canada after the American Revolution. You have Chief Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader who was a critical ally to the British, helping to defend Canada from American invasion in the War of 1812. And of course, Gabriel Dumont, the great military leader of the Métis people. These were nation builders, not just historical side notes. So these relationships were often formalized through treaties. And the crucial point here is that a treaty is a nation-to-nation agreement. But, and this is a huge but, there was often a profound misunderstanding. For Indigenous nations, treaties were sacred promises, often made orally, about sharing the land and living in peace forever. For the Crown, they were often seen through a very narrow legal lens as written contracts for land surrender. This fundamental difference in understanding is a key source of conflict that continues to this very day. This brings us to a much darker chapter in Canadian history. That relationship of partnership and alliance, well, it began to shift in the 19th century to one of control and assimilation. And to understand the Canada of today and why we talk so much about reconciliation, we have to understand this period honestly. At the very heart of this policy were the residential schools. For your exam, Block 179 gives you the core definition. They were government-funded, church-run schools designed to assimilate Aboriginal children into mainstream Canadian culture. But this simple definition, it barely scratches the surface of their true purpose and their devastating impact. In fact, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, after hearing from thousands of survivors, concluded that the school system could best be described as cultural genocide. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a well-intentioned policy that just went wrong. The goal was to deliberately sever children from their families, their languages, their cultures, and their very identities. And the impacts of this system didn't just end when the last school closed its doors. They echo through generations. The loss of language and culture has been immense. The trauma that those children experienced has been passed down, leading to ongoing challenges today. And that deep distrust of institutions like schools, churches, and the government, that's a direct legacy of this broken relationship. Another tool of control was the Indian Act, which imposed a totally new system of governance. And this is a high-value exam concept. The Act created elected band councils to manage reserves, but, and this is key, many nations already had their own systems of traditional or hereditary leadership based on their own laws and customs. These two systems still exist today, and sometimes they come into conflict, which helps explain some of the complex political situations you might see in the news. The guide points to this date from Block 258, 1960. That's the year First Nations people were finally able to vote in federal elections. But to really get this, you have to understand why it took so long. Before 1960, for a First Nations person to get the right to vote, they had to go through something called enfranchisement. That meant legally giving up their Indian status and all of their treaty rights. It was a terrible choice, and most people refused, choosing their identity over a vote in the Canadian system. So after decades and decades of activism and struggle, we get to a major turning point. The patriation of Canada's Constitution in 1982 wasn't just about bringing our highest law home from Britain. It became a moment where Indigenous peoples fought for and won the recognition of their rights within that very law. And this is it. This is the crucial point, and maybe the most important legal concept in this entire explainer. It's Section 35 of the Constitution. If you remember one thing for your exam, remember this from Block 187. Section 35 recognizes and affirms the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada.
But what does recognizes and affirms actually mean? Well, let's break it down. It means the Constitution recognizes that these rights existed long before 1982. It affirms them, which gives them the highest level of legal protection in the entire country. This guarantees that a government can't just pass a simple law to get rid of them. In fact, Section 35 is so powerful, it isn't even subject to the Charter's notwithstanding clause. It really stands apart as a fundamental pillar of Canadian law.
Now, Section 35 protects two kinds of rights, and this is another critical distinction to master for the test. Aboriginal rights are inherent. They exist simply because Indigenous nations were here first, governing themselves on their lands. They don't come from a document. Treaty rights, on the other hand, are the rights that come from those specific negotiated agreements we talked about. Both are protected, but they come from different places. Don't get them confused. So, all of this brings us to today and the path forward. Recognizing rights in the Constitution was a massive step, but the work of actually repairing that broken relationship and building a new one based on respect, recognition, and self-government, that is the ongoing project of our time. This process is called reconciliation, and it is so much more than just an apology. Reconciliation is an ongoing action. It requires telling the truth about the past, which the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did. It requires apology, which has happened. But most importantly, it requires concrete actions to repair the harm. The 94 calls to action from the TRC provide a roadmap for all of us, governments, institutions, and every single citizen. And this slide perfectly illustrates how relationships are being rebuilt. The treaty process is still happening, but modern treaties are very, very different from the historic ones. While historic treaties were often short documents focused on peace and sharing, modern treaties are incredibly detailed legal agreements. They clarify land ownership, resource rights, and most crucially, powers for self-government. The creation of Nunavut in 1999, which you'll see in Block 368, is the most powerful example of a modern treaty literally reshaping the map of Canada and empowering Inuit self-determination. Okay, let's put it all together. If you can just remember this 5-point story, you can connect any specific fact from the guide. Ready? 1. Indigenous nations were here first. 2. Early relationships were partnerships built on treaties. 3. Assimilation policies were designed to break that relationship, and they caused deep, lasting harm. 4. Section 35 of the Constitution finally protected Indigenous rights in Canada's highest law.
And 5, reconciliation is the ongoing work of all Canadians to repair that relationship.
And that brings us to the final and really the most important point. The work of reconciliation doesn't just belong to governments or Indigenous leaders. The TRC was crystal clear. It's a responsibility for all of us. As you prepare to become a citizen, this isn't just history to be memorized for a test. It's a living, breathing part of Canada's story that you are about to join. So the question I want to leave you with is this: what practical step will you take to be a part of that journey?